Hi, Dr. Greg. A very good evening to you.
Hey, Armin, how are you doing?
I'm doing absolutely fine. How about you?
Yeah, great. Yeah, actually been a big day. I had an online class early this morning for a while, and then I've had mentoring consulting work this afternoon. So we're getting towards the end of the day here. So
Yes, perfect. And it's so good to see you after a long time.
yes, indeed. It seems like a very long time, and I'm sure it's not as long as it seems, but it does seem like a very, very long time.
Yes, I guess we met last when I think in SQL Sat Brisbane, probably.
Yeah, SQL Saturday Brisbane. Yeah, indeed. And yes, and when you posted the other week, I was trying to think of the first time, and I think in person it was certainly in Barcelona,
Yes,
but yes, I'm sure somewhere online before that. So
absolutely great. I think it's going to be a while. People have to see each other virtually.
yes, indeed. Yeah, I must admit I've become very, very used to it now. In fact, we used to travel non-stop between where we live in the sort of Coffs Harbour area and Melbourne. In fact, we were in Melbourne a lot. And we had lined up for this year, we already had every 2 weeks, flight to Melbourne, flight back, flight to Melbourne. So it was, and worse, it was like here to Sydney to Melbourne and back and so on. And of course, we had pre-bought all of those for the whole year, and the airline then went broke. So it was like, oh, really? So
Great.
it was, yeah, Virgin locally. I mean, we loved them as an airline, but I mean, yeah, it's unfortunately they went under. They're sort of recovering a bit at the moment. We'll see what happens. So
Perfect. So we have, of course, Dr. Greg, thank you so much for joining us. So this is one of our first Data Platform Geeks Geek Talk. We just have a few participants in Zoom right now, and a few have joined live stream on YouTube. And the whole idea behind this Geek Talk is to do a kind of a 30-minute chat with experts like yourselves on various technologies that might interest today's tech audience. I just did something with SQL Server today morning on extended events. You know, SQL Server is of course one of my favorites and something that I do most of the times.
Of course, same here.
Yeah, you're
although I must admit, yeah, I mean, I've spent the whole afternoon in SQL Server today again, but I do spend a lot of time nowadays in Azure Data Factory. There's a lot of time in there, and obviously in Power BI, and but also, sorry, analysis services as well.
Absolutely. So, yeah, so the audience, you're all here. Thank you so much for joining today. I have Dr. Greg Lowe with me, and Dr. Greg Lowe is from Australia, and you have joined today, so you probably already know about who he is and what kind of experience he has, but let me take the honors here to kind of introduce him to you. He is a Microsoft Certified Master of SQL Server, a very long time MVP, Microsoft Most Valuable Professional, and also a Microsoft Regional Director from the ANZ region. And apart from all these titles, what's more important is that decades of experience working with data analytics. And he's someone who has worked on toughest, data and SQL deployments, with working with terabytes of data. That's the kind of enterprise experience Dr. Greg Lowe brings on the table. And I'm so glad and honored that our first Geek Talk with Data Platform Geeks begins with him. So this is really incredible. And there's also a very humble opinion that I have, which is all three titles he has, I share that with him, which in itself becomes an honor, not because I have the title, because I share that with him. So that's truly an honor.
I think, look, for anyone who doesn't know the regional director group, it's a truly amazing group of people.
Yes.
I think there's currently about 150 worldwide or something, but it's different to the MVPs, where the MVPs tend to be people with deep technical knowledge on a particular topic. And all of the RDs tend to have that as well. But the more general thing is that most of them are business leaders. They're cross technology. They can just give you sort of insights and business insights that you just I've never found anywhere else.
Absolutely, absolutely. No two ways about that. So friends, today's topic is Enterprise Power BI. And let me just tell you, what is this Geek Talk format really? They're not going to be PowerPoints or deep dive demos or something. The whole idea is to understand a concept. That's what Geek Talk is all about. We have one with Dr. Greg Lowe today, and as many of you might know, another one in the evening, later part after a few hours, we have another one with Ben Weisman and Anthony Nocentino, just to kind of call this out again on Kubernetes and big data clusters. So when it comes to Enterprise Power BI, now all of you probably are working with Power BI in some capacity as a service online, or maybe you're working with Power BI desktop. So let's begin with this by asking Dr. Greg Lowe. Dr. Greg Lowe, what exactly is Enterprise Power BI?
Yeah, I think where this comes from, if you look at the background of Power BI, it's grown, they'd almost say virally, you know, it's gone out there in the market really, really quickly, right? A big part of that, if you look back, originally they had it as all Excel add-ins and things like that. And they realized that Excel was a limitation in getting it out the door. There were things that were good about that, right? So for example, one of the problems with BI tools as a whole is that organizations spend a lot of money on them, and often it's a very small number of people in the organization who actually get to make use of the information once they've spent the money. And they realized that a lot of the reason for that was the tools were not particularly familiar. And so there was this sort of learning curve, and that was a hassle. So they had this idea initially that if you look at most organizations, they have a shed full of people who just live their life in Excel all day long. And they were thinking, oh, it'd be a great idea if we just added some things onto Excel. Then all of a sudden, these people would be in a tool they already know, but then they could just learn a few more things and they could do a ton more things, right? This was the thinking. The problem with that, which sounded sort of really viable and so on, is that, of course, they tied it to the latest version of Office 365 at the time. And of course, not everybody was running that. So that's a problem, right? And so I would go into government departments and they were still running Excel 2010 or Excel 2013 or something like this. And so you just go, well, that's not going to work, right? So they realized that was a major stumbling block. And so what they did is that's why they sort of broke it out as a separate tool. And the desktop component of it, basically they gave away, right? I mean, that was the general idea. And so that's a wonderful thing. And they bundled in what effectively was Power Query and Power Pivot and Power View, really, the older tool for that. And they gave that away with the idea that they give that away and you use the service and you pay for the service once you get to a certain point. And look, that's a fabulous story. And that's gone out all over the place, right? And if you look at James Phillips, who was heading up that team, when he started doing this, he had a mantra that was 5 minutes to wow. So the idea was that you would start using this thing and within 5 minutes, you'd be sitting there going, wow, you know, that's kind of what he wanted. And to a large degree, that they very much achieved that, right? But then the issue is in an enterprise, once you get past that 5 minutes where you go, this is completely awesome, the question is, how do you fit it into the enterprise, right? And if you look, even with SQL Server, you mentioned before, there's always been this sort of looking down that people had on Access and applications like that over the years. And it was because there were all these little lumps of data that were growing up all over the organization that were not in any way controlled by the organization. And the IT people tended to get really kind of uptight about all this Access stuff. And in most SQL Server circles, when you talk to people about Access, they look at you like, oh, you know, it was one of those Access things, you know, and so on. People really didn't like it much. But look, I don't knock it, because the thing that Access did is it created applications and things that would never have existed if it was waiting on the IT people to do the work, right? And so there's a lot of applications got started. Now, they might not have been very good applications, but they did get started, right? And in many cases, they then got picked up and turned into something corporate once they became important to the organization. But where they got a bad reputation, of course, is that organizations quickly became dependent on them, and yet there was no control, no source control, there was no anything or processes around it, and people became really dependent on it. And so all of a sudden, when the access thing didn't work properly, suddenly they realized it was critical to the enterprise in some way, and that was hopeless, right? Now, the thing is, the same thing can happen with Power BI. So what you're getting is you're getting groups of people all over organizations who are suddenly pulling in bunches of data, building out bits of applications and reports and things like that in a fairly uncontrolled fashion, right? And the hassle with this is that I'm seeing more and more then enterprises who look at this and go, yeah, that's excellent, but like, how do we fit that into what we do? You know what I mean? Because they're terribly, terribly worried about how this all works, right? And in so many places that still, I like the idea though, that these things are getting created. I spend a lot of time in financial organizations, and people like investment managers and all these sort of people, they love Power BI, right? They love being able to do things with it. And if they had written down what they needed and waited for their IT people to build something like that, they would have been waiting forever, like in many cases. And they would not have got what they wanted. Yeah, that's the other thing. We've got to admit that as IT people, is that if you go and ask users what they want, the first thing to understand is they don't know, And so the thing is, when you ask somebody, they say, look, even if you sat down and wrote exactly what somebody said and you delivered it, it wouldn't be what they want, right? And this is the folly that I see in so many IT projects, where people believe you can go and specify the whole thing, write it all down, build it, and then hand it to a user, and it never works, right? It never works. In fact, you'd know Dave Dustin from New Zealand, right? And I remember Dave was having a bad day a while ago, and he said he was just going to spend the day going and building and delivering exactly what people asked for. Because he knew that would be a disaster and that they would hate him, but he would have done exactly what they asked. And see, this is part of the problem, is that people don't know, right? And so even if you take really good notes, you'll be wrong. And so if somebody says, look, I need to analyze this, I don't know, these sales, they'll say the word sales, but they meant profit, yeah? Or something like that. But the word sales is what came out of their mouth. And so the problem with that is if you build it where you have the sales, even if you did it perfectly, it won't be what they want. So you need to encourage the idea that people will go off and play around with things and manipulate it till it gets into a shape where it looks pretty good to them, and so on. And you've got to accept that that's how things work, right? And in fact, the way we used to do most projects, even before Power BI arrived in many cases, is that we would go and grab a bunch of data, mock it up if we had to in Excel, sit down with the people, and then get them to the point that they were a bit happy with the analytics before you go off and build anything. You don't want to build stuff until you've got the people already looking at it and going, yeah, that's what I want, right? Then you've got this problem that they think it's nearly done, once you've mocked it up. But that's not the case. But at least at that point, you've got this idea that they're a bit comfortable with what they're after, and you're not building something that's going to be completely wrong for them. And Power BI fits really nicely with that. So it allows people to sort of mock things up, to load bits of data, manipulate it into the right shape, and they'll know when they're starting to see it look the right way. And things like Power Query is just so excellent for that, where people can sort of get it in and start transforming the data, and it makes that approachable for people who would never have had that be approachable. But then you've got the problem is that once they've done all that, what happens next, right? And so these things will start to become important for the organization, but there's no controls around it. There's no anything that's needed. And then they look at Power BI and they look at all their enterprise processes and they go, how does this fit? You know? And the problem is, at the moment, in many cases, it doesn't fit very well, right? So there are a number of things that you have to get your head around early on to be successful in this sort of thing, right? And so, I mean, a simple example to start with is something like identity is a good example. So if you have people who run off and just start creating their own identities, you know, online, they can do that and they can create things and have that in Power BI and all seems good. But then again, how's that going to map with your identity on premises, right? And importantly, now you can set that sort of stuff up, but what I've found that's been interesting over the years is that now sometimes is a blocker that we never used to have before. So we used to be able to go and do BI projects and almost not talk to those IT people. You know, we'd go into an organization and some department or section and get us to do some project, and then we could almost do it independent of the IT people. But then I had one of the first ones that hit me with Power BI is we would, of course, had a dependency on Active Directory, and we were trying to start to roll out a project. And that's when I found all I needed was a little bit of configuration done at the Active Directory end in the organization. But then I found, well, they had started to try and move to Office 365. And so they were part way through setting up hybrid identities and things. But then that project had got stalled. And the reason it got stalled is they had an add-on for Outlook, which was one of their document management things that attached to Outlook, that didn't work properly with Office 365. And so all of a sudden, so the Office 365 project got held up, then the identity project got held up, waiting on that. And so all of a sudden, we weren't able to do our BI project properly because of some add-on for Outlook that I'd never heard of wouldn't work properly with Office 365. Right? So,
classic case.
And you just look and go, that's just ridiculous, right? And so something like identity, you must sort that out like early on. When you're starting to do any of these sort of projects, you really have to get that sorted out. And there are options. Like, I mean, if you end up with the same domain as what you have internally, that's just wonderful, right? And if we have on-premises Active Directory, we've got Azure Active Directory, and we have AD Connect doing the synchronization between them. Generally, that's a really good story. For most people today, when you first get there, the on-premises Active Directory is the core directory for the organization. And they see the Azure Active Directory as a sort of an add-on to that. But I have little doubt that down the track, of course, that'll be the primary directory, not the other way around. So it's really important to start thinking about that Active Directory is going to be the main directory for the organization as time goes on, right? Now, it has lots of things that are really good. If you look at Azure Active Directory, if you haven't spent a lot of time looking at that, it's one of the things we normally look at in amongst looking at Enterprise Power BI things, because it's important to understand some of the differences between the different versions. Again, it has versions, you know, and that you can use on that. Simple things like how you do branding makes a world of difference to how it looks and so on. Those sorts of things, but also to decide like who is going to live in that directory and what are the groups of people. And so you need to understand for a start that there are internal users who are Active Directory users, right? So that's fine. But the next category of users are business to business users, right? And if I look at a traditional setup, if I go to, I don't know, financecompanya.com today, what most of them do is they set me up a credential where I'm suddenly Greg Lowe at financecompanya.com. And if I go to superannuationcompanyb.com, They set me up as, g.low@superannuationcompanyb.com, and so on and so on. This has been the typical way we do this stuff, in the industry, where somebody does a bit of work for us or whatever, we set them up something within our organization. But you need to learn to think differently about that, right? So with business to business, I can be logged on as, greg@sqldownunder.com, like my own one, and they can then add me to groups and things and stuff inside their directory without having to have my identity, as a separate thing being set up over there. So it's important that, again, as soon as you start playing with identity, you want to think, am I going to have external partners involved? Am I going to have people like this involved? How do I bring them into the directory? Right? That becomes really, really important. Then you've also got the next layer, which says, what do I do with, our customers? What do I do with members of a superannuation fund, a retirement fund, things like that? Where do they live, right? And most of the time today, people still have them living in databases. So I'll go to a database and there'll be username something or other and a hashed password and so on and so on. That'll be stored in a database, and that's how people do it, right? But that's never a good idea, right? So often I see people building and rolling their own identity systems. This is never a good idea, right? So anytime you find yourself starting to build code that authenticates users and things, you just want to hit yourself in the head and say, stop doing that, right? And so, because if you look at it, it's hard to get it right, right? I mean, you look at Microsoft and Google and all these people, they have thousands of engineers working on that stuff and they still get it wrong. It's almost like the height of arrogance to think, I will build an authentication system and I'll get it right, even though all of them couldn't get it right.
No, yeah. In fact, with this enterprise, explanation and the example that you're giving, Dr. Greg, this reminds me of how we used to do it years back. In fact, 2 decades before, when we started, because I had no formal knowledge in software development lifecycle,
Yep.
so to say, security was something that we used to do at the end of the application.
Yes.
And then we learned it the hard way that security is something that you got to do in the very beginning. And what actually ended up, we landing deploying the software with everyone in the organization having admin privileges.
Yep. Yeah. It's like the thing you always got to remember is that security isn't an add-on. You know what I mean? And so security is something you have to have baked in. And to give you the best example I ever saw of why security is a problem, when they did a big security upgrade in Windows in Vista, right? Vista wasn't a very good operating system, but it did have a lot of really, really good security things that they did in it. And they went through all of the applications that were built into Windows, and they did a security audit on them, right? And one of the ones that failed was Calculator, right? And so you look at it, and the calculator in Windows Vista was like the most basic little calculator. And you just look at that and go, how could you possibly get that wrong, right? And what was interesting is that at that stage, Calculator was an admin-only application. Right? And the reason for that is that the people who'd written the code had an option where you could change from normal mode to scientific. And when you change that, it wrote it into a registry key that only an administrator had access to. Right? And you just go, whoa, like if you can't build something like Calculator and get security right, the idea that you can just add security on later, that is just so naive, right? So these things do need to be tested in a sort of security-based thing right up front. It's how you got to do it. So anyway, but the idea is that in Azure Active Directory, we also have business to consumer, where they have built a whole directory structure that you can then use for members and customers and things and all of that stuff as well. So there's a whole lot of stuff you need to think about in terms of identity. First up, it's like, how do I do that? The second thing is it's really nice when you look at, say, Power Query or Power BI, and I can go off and load up hundreds of thousands of rows out of a table somewhere, and drag that into Power BI and do amazing things with it. The question is, do I really want everybody in the building pulling in hundreds of thousands of rows into Power BI? And clearly I don't, right? I mean, that's not something you want to be doing, right? And so that isn't where you want to be doing the manipulation of the data, right? The cold, hard reality. The other thing is that they always, if you look at so many examples, what people do is they connect Power BI or whatever straight to these tables and things in databases and things, and that's where they go and grab the data from, or maybe it's files or those sort of things as well. But that whole structure as a concept, that's got hidden pain in that. But also, if you look at what they're connecting to, most of the time they're connecting to relational databases, right? And the problem is the underlying relational database is not structured in the slightest towards anything that looks like a data model you want to be building over the top of, right? So you get this sort of question all the time where people say, do I still need to build something that looks like a bit of a data warehouse or something like that? And the real answer is yes, right? You'll see demo after demo after demo where people are in there, writing T-SQL queries in Power BI and pulling off data out of various tables and things and doing the work in there. But it's just not what you want to be doing. Because otherwise, in every single report, every single thing you build, you're going to be doing all that manipulation of the data again and again and again. And now, if you're in Power BI Premium, you've got some things around that where you can pull that into data flows and so on and have them stand alone. But there's still, even at the enterprise level, huge number of customers that I work with, Power BI Premium is still out of their reach, in a lot of cases. I don't know what the licensing is like in India, but like here in Australia, the starting point is about $80,000 or $90,000 a year as a starting point, right? And so for someone who wants to just, let's try Power BI in the enterprise, committing to $80,000 or $90,000 as a start before you start adding all the other costs on, that's a pretty steep sort of thing, right? And so there's a lot of organizations who'll go, yeah, that's no problem at all. But that's not the vast majority of organizations, right? And so most people need to have something else where they can start another way apart from that. For me, it's also a real hassle where they tend to have a lot of fairly complicated SQL sitting inside the Power BI stuff, right? And again, that's not where you want it, right? So if you go to change something in the database, how do you find that code, right? And this is one of the things that worries me too, is I go into enterprises all the time where the people who look after the database feel like they can't change anything. And the reason they can't change anything is they know if they change something, somebody's going to yell at them, and they don't know who it is until they change it, right? But they know somebody will probably yell at them, right? And the reason is they have no visibility into all the code that runs against the database. And so if you want to change something in the database and I have to suddenly look in every Access database, every spreadsheet, every Power BI thing, every T-SQL report, I just go through the list, you can't find all those things, but when you change it, there's going to be somebody has something that breaks, right? And you don't want to be the person doing that. So what happens is a lot of this stuff is done in the first place where people think it's done to be agile. And what they end up building is the exact opposite of agile because they're not game to make changes, right? And so you've got to think like the place for complicated SQL is not inside Power BI, right? You just do not want it in there, at all. Then another thing you need to look at is how do I do project management, right? And so one of the things it's worth spending some time with for people that haven't, I think Azure Devops is a really good product. Unfortunately, they're in the middle of kind of trying to move people to GitHub. Would probably be the subtle way to say that. But the way I look at the different things at the moment, I think Azure DevOps is still a really, really good story, right? Like a really good story where GitHub has the source control stuff. Yeah, no problem. Actions is starting to be competitive with pipelines that we have in in DevOps, but I think still a long way short of pipelines and so on. But in Azure DevOps, there's all the other things. There's boards with work items and project tracking and all those sort of things. Now, it's okay. I mean, if you have a different product, you use Jira from here in Australia, or if you use, Trello or whatever the thing is you're using, that's fine. But you need something like that, when you're managing these sort of projects. The reason I like Azure DevOps is it's all really integrated, how it all ties together. And invariably, I'm deploying things like databases and stuff like that out as part of these projects as well. That's a really good place to be. Yeah. But the part of the problem with Power BI is it doesn't fit nicely in that, right? And so we've got to look at how do we sort of force fit that into a more enterprise deployment scenario? Now, like, how do we make it work in these sort of things? Now, the Power BI guys recently have added a few concepts like deployment environments and things like that. Unfortunately, they built their own rather than integrating it with tools like Azure DevOps or GitHub Actions, right? And the problem is the rest of the enterprise stuff is now getting done that way. And then Power BI has gone off and done its own thing, And so they've heard from me loud and clear that I didn't think that was a very good idea, right? But so it's okay if you're only using Power BI and that's the only thing you're using, but that's not the reality for most people, right? So then we've got to look at how do you make it fit, in amongst things where people are using other tools and deploying other things and so on as part of it. That becomes a really big deal to sort of manage that type of thing. Another big one is you got to think about like where you're manipulating or getting the data into the right shape, right? Now, again, you can do an enormous amount of stuff with Power Query and it's really powerful and so on. The only thing you've got to look at with that is if I'm doing that in Power BI, how does it going to fit with things like source control and versioning and those sorts of words? They're the sort of words that don't really fit nicely with I built a PBIX file and that's got a whole lot of transformations built into it, right? To me, we try and build most of the time an underlying data model that is suitable for analytics, that already has the data cleaned up to a large degree. And then we normally load that data and do a tabular modeling most of the time in analysis services in Azure, most of the time actually. Or if I have a very conservative customer, we'll do that in SQL Server analysis services and connect it up to Power BI instead. But Azure Analysis Services, if people haven't played around with that, that's actually really good value for the size of the data that you get to work with and the performance of it and so on, compared to Power BI Premium, right, in today's licensing. And so it's a good place for you to go and do that building. And the nice thing is, of course, you're then building a good data model and you make it easy for Power BI, right, from that point on. And the other reason that's really, really important is often in many places, Power BI is not the only thing that's using that data, right? And so still in most organizations, you're going to have a whole lot of people who want to sit in Excel all day on things, and they're going to want to connect up to that same data. And the question is, if all you do is build it inside a PBIX file, again, like what happens next, right? Now, you can publish that to Power BI and give them an analyze in Excel option and so on. But what they really want is, of course, just to being able to connect Excel straight into the data. And if we have something like Azure Analysis Services in place, they can do that, just the same. And the same data gets presented to them as gets sent up to the Power BI service, right? And if I want to use reporting services, it can connect to analysis services. It can connect to the same thing. Now, eventually, if you have Power BI Premium, you could be using the analysis services bits of it rather than using analysis services separately. It's the same stuff, right? So there's no downside. So you could start with analysis services. It even has a developer tier, right? Tiny sort of tier, and you could build your stuff there and then move it up. One of the other things I really like with analysis services is you can pause it. Many of the services in Azure don't pause, right? So if I have an Azure SQL database, I pay for it every minute that it's running, right? And there's no stop running or something like that, right? Azure SQL Data Warehouse has a pause. Analysis Services has a pause. So I can spin up one of these Analysis Services servers. And in fact, if I had people who are only working in the daytime, I could literally pause it before the evening, spin it up again first thing in the morning, and I'd literally be paying a third of the price instead of the normal price, right? And so on. And people wouldn't even notice there's a difference, right? So these sort of things, there's lots and lots of options around how you can do that. But it gives you a place to build a really nice data model. Right? And it's interesting that it came up yesterday. We're having a discussion about things where I had someone who's trying to learn right now how to create measures and doing bits of DAX and things like that. And they were struggling with the most complicated little bits of DAX. And again, the problem, if I was saying to people yesterday, if you find yourself writing complicated DAX, then you have a data model problem. You don't have a DAX problem. You know what I mean? So it's not that you don't know enough about DAX yet. The problem is you've got an underlying data model problem that you should fix, and then the DAX will become simpler, right? Something like that. So
very similar to the T-SQL queries.
Yeah, again, look, it's actually, yeah, you're dead right. It's actually the same sort of thing. If your tables are normalized and structured properly, then your queries become easy, right? But if your tables are just a complete mess, your queries will be a complete mess. and you don't want that, right? So look, there's lots of these.
Dr. Greg,
the final thing I do want to mention is just there's also, of course, the security. And the upside of having something like Analysis Services or one of those things in place is you get to do row-level security at that point. And then the same security applies in Power BI and in Excel and in reporting. So anything that connects to the data. It becomes a really strong story for the security. And the beautiful thing is, of course, in Power BI, when you're doing that, you don't have to change your report. You don't have to do anything. It's just based on who the user is. They're going to see the appropriate data.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dr. Gray. That was an awesome overview of Enterprise Power BI and what really it means. And I think the story was very well laid out. You had talked about the versioning thing, and how you just brought up the PBIX file, etc. So something came to my mind. Does TFS fit in here in any way, or is it like Azure DevOps taking over that?
TFS is sort of passe now. And so everything, look, I mean, it's still there and TFS is being used heavily, right? So there's always these stories that say TFS is going away. Microsoft has such a big investment in products that are being built on TFS. TFS is not going anywhere in a hurry, right? Make no mistake. And in fact, if you look at the stats, everything they talk about is Git now. But if you look at the stats, the usage of TFS is still going up all the time. So what do they say? The stories of my death are probably questionable, right? And so whatever Mark Twain said, but and so that's the thing, is it's still going, but everybody is heading down the Git path now. So if you're not using a Git-based source code repository, then you really ought to learn to do that. The nice thing is it fits nicely with SQL Server data tools, either for building databases or tabular models or things like, it just works, really nicely with that sort of thing. I find Azure DevOps, again, is a good Git repository that works really, really well with all those tools. It also integrates really nicely with things like Azure Data Factory. So if you're using that for doing manipulation and moving data around and so on, that sort of tooling is really important. And it just integrates beautifully with how that works in there. And so, I mean, you could use an external GitHub repository. So GitHub's just a commercial product that was built using the Git protocols, right? And so it's a bit weird for Microsoft at the moment because they've bought GitHub, but they already owned Azure DevOps, right? And Azure DevOps had a Git repository. So then it's like, okay, so what happens next there? So somewhere down the track, there's going to be one, right? And based upon the numbers, I think there's something like 50 or 100 times more people on GitHub than there are on Azure DevOps. Yeah, you can imagine that, that there'll be a merging somewhere down the path of how that works, because that's where most of the people are. But the thing is, today, Azure DevOps is a wonderful story, right? In terms of the number of things you get. And they also have a free up to 5 user version of that as well. So you don't even have to pay for the first 5 users. For a lot of organizations or people trying to learn and things like that, that is a really good story. I mean, GitHub has free stuff, but it's only for public repositories. And so they have a personal account where you can do small amounts of stuff and so on, but it's nothing like what you can do with Azure DevOps today, right? Again, they'll merge those two teams. They'll eventually merge the products and so on. But there's so much code in both of those at the moment that I wouldn't be too worried about the merge situation. I think that's going to end up being pretty seamless down the track.
Great. So Dr. Greg, looks like some questions are coming in now.
Mm-hmm.
So I will invite the audience here to ask questions, use the Q&A panel. And while you put down your questions, we'll just take a minute and ask Dr. Greg to just kind of explain or, talk about his full day class that he is doing at Data Platform Virtual Summit. So, I mean, this is just a very quick geek talk over Enterprise Power BI, but you all should know that he is also doing a full day class at Data Platform Virtual Summit on Enterprise Power BI. So while questions are coming in, Dr. Greg, can you just quickly talk about the class and what are you going to cover?
Yeah, so we have. And so look, this year, I haven't been able to get to the summit for the previous years. It hasn't worked that way for me. This is great. This year, I finally get to present some stuff virtually at the summit, which is great. And we have the pre-con beforehand. And so the pre-con, we're basically spending 2 half days, basically. And the idea is I'm sort of going through all the most important aspects of the things that I've started to sort of talk about and hint about there today. But I want people to come away from it comfortable about, how do we do identity properly? How do we build an appropriate data model that this stuff gets loaded in? How do we load the data into a data model? How do we do all of these things in an enterprise fashion? How do we build an analytic model? How do we connect Power BI up? How do we structure what we do in Power BI as opposed to what we do in the analytic model? And so on and so on. So it's all that sort of stuff. And also then, how do we do project management and those sort of things?
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Greg. So yeah, please look up for his class on dataplatformvirtualsummit.com. I will ask my colleague to just put down that URL in the chat window. So Dr. Greg, here is the first question from today's Geek Talk from Rizwan. His question is, how the DAX play a role in data model, trying to understand the role of DAX in making the data model optimized. And he says, star schema, what is the role of DAX? So that's the question.
All good. Yeah, all good. And so look, the general structure, if you want to think about it, the normal thing we do is we start with a relational database, and that's all T-SQL work, right? From there, we normally build a data model, which is still a relational database, but it's something that's designed to support analysis. We go to a lot of trouble to make sure that it's, really, really structured around how somebody does analysis. And that's, of course, still T-SQL that we're largely doing the work with to do that. From there, the information gets loaded up. Most of the time we use analysis services next, but analysis services or Power BI Premium, they have the equivalent of Power Query at the front end. We tend to do pretty simplistic stuff in there. We'll rename tables, we'll, do a few of those sort of things, but it won't be complicated transformations that are happening inside Power Query there. Because again, that makes it much, much harder to track and work with down the track. So I want that to be pretty simple, but of course that's M language by the time you get to loading that up. Once you get the tables inside the analytic data model, like in analysis services, this is where DAX comes in. So DAX is used for any expressions or calculations we need to do, again, in the data model. So it's either in Power Pivot in Excel, or it's in the data model inside Power BI, or it's in the tabular model inside analysis services, all exactly the same, basically. And what we try and do in there are just things that you can't really do at a lower level, right? So we don't tend to manipulate the data too much or cleanse data or do any of those things there. We tend to have that already done in bulk at a lower level in the T-SQL work. But inside that, you start doing things like I create, for example, measures is a good example. So a measure will be maybe I want to add up this column, and maybe I want to add up this column only where some other column has a value in it of something, whatever. But I'm building a calculation for the rows in that table. But what's different about that to T-SQL is if I build a thing that says, add up all the transactions in T-SQL, I'm saying from this date to that date, and then I'm doing that. But with an analytic model, you want to be able to just slice through and go this month, and suddenly it knows they're the ones you're talking about. But I don't have to go and rebuild different formulas and things. I can build a measure in DAX, and then that's the thing that's applied. And so it's a language which is designed more for, originally was for calculated columns and measures and things like that. But it's expanded out now to a fairly sophisticated language of its own. But in most of the way we tend to structure things, as I said, people tend not to have to do a lot of tricky DAX, right? We don't tend to do a lot of tricky stuff in DAX because, again, I think it's probably the wrong place to be doing a lot of that stuff. Most of the time, as I said, when I see tricky DAX, it's often something back further that should have been done properly, right? But that said, look, DAX itself, I don't personally think it's a great language to just go and learn the whole language. Where if I look at something like T-SQL, I think it's important to learn most of T-SQL and then start to learn to run queries. But again, you don't learn every little piece of T-SQL. You get enough under your belt that you can start building queries and so on. But what happens with DAX is that I find that I think I know about 3 people worldwide who think in DAX. You know what I mean? They live and breathe DAX to the point that they sort of think DAX. But most other people dabble in DAX to different levels, right? And so what happens is you get more experienced and you get better and better at dabbling in DAX. But very few people ever get to like a complete mastery of DAX, right? But I mean, there are classes around, Marco and Alberto and all, run mastering classes on DAX and stuff. You can do that. Now, I wouldn't knock that. But the only thing is I find that if you just go and learn it as a language, you don't have context in what you're learning and you don't realize why those things matter, right? So you could spend ages talking about row contexts and things and whatever, but until you have a problem you're trying to solve, it really is hard to make that stuff jam into your head properly, right? I think what is much better is the same guys, actually, they just do amazing work, Marco and Alberto, but they've released a site now called daxpatterns.com. And what they do instead is they have a whole site and videos on each one that show you through how to do specific patterns. And this is a far better approach, right? Because you get stuck trying to work out how to do something, you go and find a pattern for doing it. You know, rather than learn the whole language, it's like, oh, how do you do that? Let me go and find something that does that. Right. And it used to be the same with the old MDX language in multidimensional analysis services. Again, I think I know 4 people who think in MDX, you know, that sort of thing. But everybody else, again, sort of dabbles in it. But one of the books I loved, there was a book by Art Tenek that was like MDX recipes. You know, so it was not like a whole book on how do you learn MDX. It was, if you're trying to do this, here's an example over here. You know, if you're trying to do that, here's an example here. And it's the same sort of thing with things like DAX patterns.
Right. Problem solution approach, cookbook kind of stuff. Yeah. So audience, this is a good site that you may want to take a note of, which is
That was
daxpatterns.com by,
daxpatterns.com. Yeah.
yeah, daxpatterns.com by Marco Russo and Alberto Ferrari. Yeah. They do incredible
What
stuff.
they've actually done,
Yeah.
which I really love, is they have
Yeah.
all of the patterns on the website,
Mhm.
and they have all of the stuff sitting there. They've created a book that you can get, but it contains all the same stuff that's on the website. So it's more just how you want to consume that. But yeah, I really love what they've done with that. The other thing is, as part of what I'll go through in the course when we do that as part of the summit, I also want to show you through a number of the tools that we use that just make it much, much easier to build things. You know, there's all the standard tools, of course, but then there's the ones that people really use that make a major difference to your understanding and how quickly you can build things.
Absolutely. So, Dr. Greg, we have one more question now from Vishal. He says, hey, hello, Dr. Greg, great session. How do we get best practices scenarios for enterprise Power BI? I'm working on my organization and handling more than 1,000 users. So kind of trying to get a clear picture of enterprise Power BI.
Yeah, the core, as I said, the core things you have to be working on is, as I said, we need to sort out identity. We need to sort out how the loading and transformation of the data goes. We need to work out how to get appropriate data models and structures in that. We need to work out how to do the appropriate security of the data. And then we need to work out how to manage the whole process. And so all of those things together are part of that.
Perfect. I guess, Satya, can you check in YouTube if there are any questions?
Checking, just a second.
Looks like no more questions in
Nope,
Zoom
all
here.
good.
Yep, no questions in YouTube also.
Okay. All right, then we are all good with time. We shot over 5 minutes, but that's absolutely great. Any wealth of knowledge from Dr. Greg is all good. So,
Correct. Thanks,
yes.
Armand.
Yeah, here we are. So thank you very much, Dr. Greg, for joining us. And thank you, audience, for coming forward with the first Geek Talk, Data Platform Geeks. We have one more coming up later in the evening. And every Thursday, we are trying to do something different. Next Thursday, we have something on machine learning with Anupama Natarajan. And she's also a speaker at dataplatformvirtualsummit.com. So reminding you again, dataplatformvirtualsummit.com. Do visit and see if you have more learning stuff out there and if you wish to join us. Thank you very much. Have a good day. See you soon.
Awesome. All good. Thanks, folks.
Thank you, Dr. Greg. Have a good day. Bye. Take care.